There are 100 people on death row in the state of Pennsylvania. Randy Todd Hogg, 36 years on death row. Hogg, who suffers from Capgras syndrome, thinks that in 1982, a man who looked exactly like him abducted and killed Richard Good. A Berks County jury found him guilty of the crime and gave him a death by lethal injection sentence. According to court records, he also feels that the food he is eating in prison is sterilizing and controlling him. Hogg has been on death row in solitary confinement for over 30 years, while his capital case is pending an appeal. Hogg is unable to comprehend why he is sentenced to death, which has led the courts to declare him incompetent. Leroy Thomas, 35 years on death row. Veronica James Hans had arranged to meet her husband and friends in a mall in the afternoon of May 8, 1987. Her spouse went in search of her when she did not show up as scheduled. He proceeded to their flat on Federal Street in Philadelphia, which was located on the top 2 floors of a 3-story duplex. He was shocked to see that both their apartment's door and the building's door were unlocked. He discovered his wife's body, partially covered by pillows and a blanket, and dressed in a bathrobe, on the stair landing of the 3rd-floor bedroom. She had been stabbed, choked, and restrained while 8.5 months pregnant. She suffered almost 50 stab wounds, some of which fatally penetrated her unborn child and crucial organs. Part of the apartment's 3rd level had been looted. The bedroom had several missing items, including paper money, pocket change, an imitation Rolex watch, Mrs. Hans' high school ring, a gold chain bracelet, more watches, rings, and jewelry, and a pair of fingerless athletic gloves. There were no indications that the flat had been broken into. A window in a bedroom was open. Mrs. Hans usually didn't open the window unless she went to look at whoever was ringing the doorbell. Leroy Thomas, who is also known as Larry Rush, was sentenced to death for the murder. Don Mitchell Tedford, 37 years on death row. After finding Donald Mitchell Tedford guilty of essaying and killing Janine Revac on January 10, 1986, a Butler County jury condemned him to death in 1987. 22-year-old Janine was pursuing a career in interior design. In October or November of 1985, she visited an interior design and decorating company in Cranberry Township, Butler County, known as The Finishing Touch. There she met Tedford, who, as an inmate at the state prison in Greensburg, had been granted work release to find employment at The Finishing Touch. Revac was interviewed by Tedford, and while she was not given a job offer at that time, she expressed encouragement at the chance and promised to stay in contact. Due to a week-long illness, Revac missed work on Friday, January 10, 1986. Her husband and friends tried to call her during the day, but they were unable to reach her. A truck driver arrived to The Finishing Touch at around noon with a delivery, but the front door was shut. The truck driver noticed a young woman in the business, whom Tedford later acknowledged was Revac. She was gone from the house when her husband returned from work, and there was no letter explaining her disappearance. He contacted The Finishing Touch at about 11:30 p.m. after trying in vain to find her elsewhere. Tedford responded and gave his name as Don. In response to Revac's husband's asking Tedford if he remembered his wife, the latter said that he did remember her and that she was a highly talented girl, but he hadn't seen her that day. Revac was reported missing to the local police the following morning by her spouse. She left her car in a shopping center parking lot, which he discovered later in the day. That same day, at approximately 12:30 p.m., 2 brothers in Washington County going small game hunting discovered a young woman's body on the side of the road. They thought she was dead because of the body's rigidity and discoloration, so they called the police. She wore a silk top, black pants, a wedding band, gold earrings, a gold necklace, and 1 mesh stocking in addition to her red jacket. She had no shoes. Her slacks were found to be unbuttoned and zippered down when the body was turned over. Her bra was pushed up over her chest, which the investigator discovered when he looked beneath her top. The jacket and pants were comparatively clean, but there were some foreign items, including thin, fiber-like material, weeds, and blood. Tedford led Revac to The Finishing Touch, where he assaulted her after luring her to meet him. Then he drove her body to the Washington County woods, where he left it for the hunters to find the next day, strangling her to death out of concern that she would denounce him for the essay. John Lesko, 28 years on death row. Lesko was reportedly using drugs and drinking alcohol around Christmas 1979, while reflecting on how horrible it was that his younger brother had been abused while living in an institution. John reportedly experienced childhood essay as well, which is why he chose to take out his anger on society for treating him so unfairly. In collaboration with his friend Mike Travaglia, he abducted Levato, a security guard, and took him to Westmoreland County, where Travaglia fatally shot him. The men were hitchhiking on the north side of Pittsburgh on a bitterly cold New Year's Day morning when two newcomers stopped to give them a ride. At the time, the men were engaged in an armed robbery spree out of their hotel room in Edison, Pennsylvania. They took over newcomer's SUV and abducted her as they robbed a party supply store in Indiana County. After the heist, they left their chained captive and her truck in a parking garage in Pittsburgh after shooting her twice. By late January 2, 1980, Lesko and Travaglia had recruited a 15-year-old juvenile offender called Ricky Rutherford as a new comrade, and they were prepared to carry on with their killing rampage. The three waited for a victim to show up while hiding out in front of a hot dog stand close to their hotel. William Nichols arrived after a 10-minute delay, at which point Travaglia pointed the gun at him while opening the sports car's passenger side door and taking a seat. Travaglia shot Nichols in the arm after Rutherford and Lesko entered the back seat. Then Travaglia drove out from under the hot dog stand. Lesko gave Rutherford the order to handcuff the captive and struck Nichols in the face and chest several times, injuring him. They threatened Nichols with a knife and stole his watch and wallet. Travaglia took him into a wooded location where they gagged Nichols and threw him out of the car. Then, Lesko and Travaglia belted Nichols' legs and pulled him in the direction of a hole in an ice-covered pond while Rutherford discovered a 25-pound boulder. They threw the rock on top of him after pushing him inside. After deciding to rob a convenience store with their newfound freedom, they made a stop at Travaglia's father's home, where they took another firearm and ammunition. As the group turned back towards Pittsburgh, they passed Leonard Miller, a police officer who was seated in his patrol car outside of a stop-and-go convenience store. After racing past the officer's car and honking his horn, Travaglia claimed he just wanted to have some fun with the cop. However, no chase was initiated. Travaglia spun the vehicle around, blew past the patrol car once more, and got no response again. After Travaglia sped by him 3 times, Officer Miller activated his lights and pursued him. Lesko turned to face Rutherford, telling him to lay down in the back because it might turn into a shooting gallery as they sat in the back seat. Miller forcibly pulled the sports car to the side of the road and walked up to it. Rolling down his window, Travaglia pulled out a .38 caliber handgun and fired 2 close-range shots at Officer Miller. Travaglia afterwards asserted that the shooting was an accident. Officer Miller fired back, breaking the window on the passenger side. The policeman who had been shot laid down on the ground while the 3 men drove off. After the group left the hotel, Travaglia told a friend they had shot the police officer when they later met up. Travaglia gave the guy the .38 gun, and later that evening, the companion was caught with it. The 3 murderers were taken into custody that same evening after he turned on them. Rutherford was presented with an immunity deal in exchange for his testimony. George Banks, 38 years on death row. At his Pennsylvania home on the evening of September 24, 1982, Banks took prescription medications and drank a lot of straight gin. On September 25, 1982, the following morning, he killed 8 people in his home with an AR-15 semi-automatic weapon. Among them were 3 women in their 20s who were his girlfriends and the mothers of his children, as well as 5 children, 4 of whom were his own. After changing into military clothes and going outdoors, Banks noticed Jimmy Olsen, 22 years old, and Ray Hall, 24 years old, leave a home across the street. He apparently yelled that they would not tell anyone about this before shooting the 2 of them. He struck both individuals, leaving Hall dead. Olsen fortunately lived. Banks sped off. He proceeded to the Heather Highlands mobile home park where he was attempting to obtain custody of his son, who resided with his ex-girlfriend Sharon Mazzillo. Banks shot Mazzillo after breaking through the door. Then he shot and murdered his son, who was asleep. Banks murdered both Sharon's mother, who was attempting to contact the police, and her nephew, who was 7 years old, who was there in the house. Banks never saw the brother of Sharon, who was hiding in the closet. Being the sole survivor, he informed the authorities that Banks was the shooter. Police linked the shooting of Olson and Hall, which they had found at Schoolhouse Lane, to the victims they had studied at the mobile home park. Next, they discovered Banks's victims inside his home. After Banks abandoned his car and stole another, police started looking for him. Banks left the stolen car behind, pulled over in a remote patch of grass, and went to sleep. Banks went to his mother's home in Wilkes-Barre once he woke up. He allegedly told her about his crimes. She took him to Banks's buddy Jacob Witt's house, where he sent her on her way and got ready for a police standoff. His mother was brought to the police base so that Banks could speak with her. To convince the murderer to turn himself in, they tried a number of strategies, such as fabricating a story that was broadcast on the radio, claiming that the children were still alive and in need of blood to survive. That didn't work. After a 4-hour confrontation, it was Banks's former co-worker Robert Brunson that was able to persuade him to turn himself in. Robert Wharton, 37 years on death row. After breaking into a house, Robert Wharton and Eric Mason drowned a woman in the bathtub and strangled the man to death. Eric Mason and Robert Wharton were both taken into custody. Wharton received a death sentence and Mason received a life term. When the two men broke into Lisa Hart's family's East Mount Airy house in January of 1984, she was just 7 months old. Bradley Hart, 25 years old, was strangled, and her mother Fern, who was 30 years old, was drowned in an upstairs bathtub. The young girl was abandoned in the house, but she made it out alive. Stephen Duffy, 37 years on death row. On February 17, 1984, in the afternoon, Kathy Kernchuk's body was discovered in the woman's bathroom of Genetti's Manor, a restaurant in Dixon City, Pennsylvania. At the age of 19, the victim worked as a server at the restaurant. She was discovered in a pool of blood slumped in the bathroom stall's corner. She had suffered about 30 stab wounds. That day, a yellow Chrysler LeBaron was spotted parked behind the restaurant, according to a later police inquiry. All staff members were routinely questioned, and it was discovered that Stephen Duffy, who was working at Genetti's Manor at the time, had come by the business that day to drop off a W-4 tax form. He was found to be the driver of the yellow Chrysler LeBaron, and the vehicle parked behind the restaurant was positively confirmed as his. Ralph Stokes, 36 years on death row. The fact that Ralph Stokes and Donald Jackson took part in the March 12, 1982 robbery of Smokin' Joe's Corner led to their convictions. Stokes had worked at Smoking Joe's restaurant and bar before. Jackson stated in court that he and Stokes had prepared for the robbery by dressing in blue jumpsuits, donning ski masks, and arming themselves with guns. Stokes had a .38 caliber revolver, while Jackson carried an automatic handgun. With their weapons out, the two men went through the unlocked rear kitchen door inside the restaurant. They went up against Renard Mills and Pierre Blasingame, two workers in the kitchen. Around the same moment, Eugene Jefferson, a third employee, came into the kitchen from another area of the structure. After locking the three workers inside the walk-in refrigerator, Ralph Stokes entered the restaurant's office and spoke with Mary Figueroa, the manager and the spouse of one of Smokin' Joe's proprietors. Jackson entered the office, where Mrs. Figueroa and Ralph Stokes were arguing about who had the right to unlock the safe. Jackson then saw that Stokes' ski mask had been pulled up over his face. When Jackson ordered him to cover his face, he retorted that Mrs. Figueroa had already identified him. Along with the other three employees, Mrs. Figueroa was put in the walk-in refrigerator after she unlocked the safe. The others were informed by Mrs. Figueroa that she recognized Trent. Then she tried to be a soothing force for everyone else in the fridge. After putting everyone inside the refrigerator, Jackson and Stokes continued their restaurant looting. A mailman named Peter Santangelo occurred to stop by during these proceedings. Just enough to let the mail through, Jackson slightly opened the kitchen door before shutting it. Fearing he would be recognized, Stokes pursued the mailman, dragging him into the restaurant and telling him to lie on the kitchen floor at the touch of a revolver. Stokes pressed his ear to the refrigerator door to try and listen in on what the people inside were saying. Jackson was subsequently informed by Ralph Stokes that he had been recognized and would need to off the witnesses. At that point, Stokes opened the refrigerator and discharged 3 rounds, killing Mary Figueroa and Eugene Jefferson. When Peter Santangelo saw this happening, he bolted from the kitchen. Mr. Santangelo became the 3rd victim, receiving 3 gunshots when he was besieged at the locked front door. The 2 men then fled the scene. Henry Daniels, 34 years on death row. Daniels took part in a plan on September 1, 1988, to abduct 16-year-old Alexander Porter and hold him for ransom. In order to get Porter to come to a meeting, Henry Daniels and 3 other people staged a fictitious drug transaction. They bound and gagged Porter, took his keys, and shoved him into the trunk of his car. To keep Porter from realizing his involvement, one of the conspirators, a friend of his, permitted himself to be bound in front of Porter. After Porter was placed in the trunk, he was released and sent home, leading Porter to believe that his friend had been murdered. Porter's car was driven by the remaining conspirators to one of the people's garages, where they parked it with Porter inside. They drove to Porter's mother's house in a different vehicle, broke into the house with Porter's key. Then, they broke into his father's house, whom they thought to be extremely wealthy. When they got back, Porter was no longer wearing his handcuffs. One of the people made Porter reveal his mother's and father's phone numbers and demanded to know how much Porter was worth to his father before restraining him once more. Porter was informed that his companion had been slain and that he would also be killed if he did not cooperate. Porter gave them his dad's beeper number and his mother's phone number. At that point, Porter's captors made the decision to kill him instead of carrying out their extortion plot. Henry Daniels and one of his accomplices set out to dispose of the victim under cover of darkness. Porter was thrown face down on the side of the road. One of the conspirators shot Porter 4 times in the back of the neck with an automatic weapon, not knowing if he had died from strangling or from gagging. Michael Pierce, 33 years on death row. The powerful smell of gasoline woke Joan Pierce, Michael Pierce's sister, at around 3 in the morning on July 10, 1989. After Joan woke her father, George Pierce, they went downstairs and saw that the sofa in the living room was on fire. They had to escape the house as flames burst out as soon as George Pierce opened the cellar door. George went back into the house, hoping to save his mother-in-law and wife. George fell inside after failing to make it to the steps. Neighbors awoke by the fire and helped him out of the scorching structure. After being removed from the scene, George received burn and smoke inhalation treatment in a hospital. He was eventually moved to a nursing home where he passed away 6 months later from difficulties brought on by bronchopneumonia and smoke inhalation. Mary Pierce and Anna Hayes, the 95-year-old mother, were declared dead at the site. Smoke and soot inhalation was later found to be the cause of death. The Philadelphia Fire Department's experts conducted an investigation and found that the house burned down as a consequence of 2 distinct fires that were intentionally started. According to Joan Pierce's testimony, there was a great deal of tension between her brother and parents. Michael Pierce had claimed that his parents had denied him an inheritance from his uncle Al and had steroid-infused his diet. George and Mary had urged their son to vacate the family home a week before the fire. Many times, Pierce had confided in Joan that he detested their parents and he wanted to kill them. Before the fire, on Sunday night, Joan had seen her brother. He was dressed in jeans, a dark t-shirt, a red flannel shirt, and boots. Aaron Jones, 30 years on death row. The Junior Black Mafia, JBM, a drug distributing group in Philadelphia, was led by Aaron Jones. in an attempt to exact revenge for the passing of Leroy Davis, another senior JBM official who was thought to have been killed by Brian Thornton. Jones planned the assassination of Brian Kennedy. Thornton was already in prison. Thus, in order to get revenge for Davis's death and warn Thornton that killing a fellow JBM member would not go unpunished, Jones and his co-defendants made the decision to hit Thornton's cousin, Kennedy. Jones helped his co-defendants kill Kennedy by giving them instructions on where and how to kill the man, setting up the car that was used in the crime, and providing money to assist them flee after the assassination. Paul Gamboa Taylor, 32 years on death row. During the early morning hours of May 18, 1991, Paul Gamboa Taylor returned to the home he shared with his wife Valerie, their 3 children, Paul, Jasmine, and Raquel, Valerie's mother Donna, and Donna's son Lance. Everyone was asleep when Gamboa Taylor got home, with the exception of Valerie, who was with a friend. Gamboa Taylor pulled a ball-peen hammer out of his toolbox, furious at his wife for being indifferent to his substance addiction. He reached into the kitchen for a knife as well. Entering Donna's bedroom, Gamboa Taylor gave her 3 blows to the head and slashed her throat with the knife. Then he repeatedly struck Lance over the head with the hammer. Gamboa Taylor entered the bedroom that his 3 children occupied after leaving Donna's bedroom. Paul and Jasmine were killed by him in an attack. The wounds claimed the lives of all 4. After that, Gamboa Taylor brought Raquel, the youngest child, into the living room, where they spent the next 11 hours waiting for Valerie to come home. Valerie was driven home by her friend Tina, who she had spent the previous evening with, at about midday on May 18, 1991. Tina stood by as Valerie went to get a pair of jeans. Gamboa Taylor emerged from the house shortly after Valerie went inside, letting Tina know that she was free to leave. Upon arriving back at the residence, Gamboa Taylor fatally injured Valerie by beating her with a hammer and covering her head with a garbage bag. He tried several suicide techniques and hid the murder weapon under the kitchen sink. Then he requested assistance from the police when he failed. When the police heard screaming, they broke into the house. Blood was all over the place and Gamboa Taylor was in the tub. He was brought to a medical facility for self-inflicted injuries treatment. Later, he turned in a written confession to the police detailing his offenses while he was being held. He was given 4 death sentences and 1 sentence of life in prison. Orlando Baez, 31 years on death row. Baez was found guilty of killing Janice Sissy Williams on January 6, 1987, by stabbing her. Williams had 86 stab wounds to her chest, back, and torso, in addition to 15 to her face, according to the autopsy. She had also been assayed and beaten and would have been conscious during the majority of the injuries. It wasn't until a driver stopped on January 7 after discovering Williams' 2 children walking outside their house while still in their pajamas that her body was discovered. The youngsters guided the driver to their mother's lifeless body on the first floor of the residence. The young woman's murder remained unresolved for 4 years until Henry Gibson, a witness, came forward and informed the police that he had saw Baez stabbing Williams that evening while he was in the apartment. Following Williams's death, Baez and Gibson left the 2 kids alone in the apartment with the mutilated body before walking home. Gibson informed authorities that Baez threatened to kill him if he revealed any information regarding the murder, so he remained silent. Baez initially stated to police that he didn't know Gibson. Then he said that Gibson stabbed Williams and he in fact was just trying to save her. Roy Williams, 30 years on death row. Roy Williams was found guilty on January 31, 1992, of first-degree murder and possessing a weapon of crime in relation to James McDonald's shooting death. Following their video gameplay in an arcade on Mulberry Street, Williams and 3 friends were strolling along Folk Road Street when the murder occurred. Williams pulled a revolver from inside his coat after McDonald turned into Folk Road Street and shot him many times in the head, chest, and leg. One witness testified during the trial that earlier that day, while getting high at a friend's house, he and Williams discussed the suspect's desire to kill the first white dude they saw. The witness claimed that Williams went back to the same residence after the shooting and boasted about having shot a white boy. Adolescent girls ages 12 and 14, who were the other two witnesses, related similar tales while testifying. According to one's testimony, Williams informed her that he had just been freed from jail and had promised to kill the first white man he saw. Williams escaped to Massachusetts, where he committed another murder and several other crimes until he was apprehended and brought back to Pennsylvania to stand trial for the killing of McDonald. The death sentence was imposed on Williams on September 14, 1993. Williams had 3 prior convictions for robbery. In the Massachusetts trials, he was also found guilty of homicide, armed robbery, and assault and battery in a different event. Records from his youth indicate that Williams had beaten his sister 3 times, one of which required hospitalization. He had smashed furniture, threatened his mother with a knife, and acted sadistically towards the family dog. Terry Ray Chamberlain, 29 years on death row. Terry was found guilty of the murders of his estranged wife, Sherry Chamberlain, and her boyfriend, Gregory Inman. On August 2, 1991, in the early hours of the morning, Sherry and Greg were discovered dead at their residence. Sherry was shot 5 times, once in the chest, where a bullet would have killed her instantly, and another in less than a minute. Greg was shot 4 times, one of them being a headshot in the manner of an execution. The shooter entered the home by smashing a typewriter through the sliding glass door, according to the police. Blood was discovered in the living room and kitchen, the 2 areas where the victims were killed, on the floors, walls, light switch, telephone, and sliding glass door. In an upstairs bedroom, blood was also discovered on a washcloth and a vanity. Thomas Hawkins, Jr., 29 years on death row. Following a 1990 trial for the June 1989 murder of his 14-year-old niece, Andrea Thomas, Hawkins was given a death sentence. Thomas was essayed, strangled with a cord, and stabbed with a fork in the back and neck inside the West Pottsgrove, New Jersey house of her grandparents. Hawkins was retried in August 1994 after the state Supreme Court reversed the conviction on a technicality, and the prosecution was successful in getting Hawkins found guilty this time around and given the death penalty again. He referred to Hawkins as an evil serial killer, noting that the 15-year-old Reading resident Karen Stubbs was strangled to death in 1981 and that Hawkins had been found guilty on third-degree murder in Berks County as well. Leroy Fears, 29 years on death row. Fears confessed that on June 18, 1994, he essayed and strangled 12-year-old Sean Hagan. Hagan had gone with the intention of spending the day swimming, fishing, and having fun on a rope swing with a few pals. Fears essayed Sean later that day after luring him to a remote part of the river. Sean was then questioned by Fears if he intended to tell his parents. Fears choked Sean because he threatened to reveal the truth. He essayed the boy once more following his passing. The boy's body was subsequently thrown into the river, and on June 21st his body was discovered floating with a tire rim around his neck. Hubert Lester Michael, 29 years on death row. When 16-year-old Trista Eng was walking to her summer employment at the Hardee's restaurant on July 12, 1993, Michael pulled up beside her in his car and asked if she needed a ride. She went inside his car after accepting his invitation. After that, Michael got out his revolver, threatened her, and drove through a secluded area in York County's state game lands. After forcing the victim out of the vehicle, he fired 3 shots from 5 to 6 feet away, hitting her once in the back, once in the chest, and once in the back of the head. Then, in an attempt to conceal the body, Michael carried it into some weeds some 30 feet away. Bortella Philistine, 29 years on death row. On June 16, 1993, 2 police officers stopped a car carrying Philistine as a passenger during a routine traffic stop in the city of Philadelphia. Philistine came out of the car as the cops got close to it, took one of their pistols, and started shooting. He killed one officer by shooting him in the head and abdomen. He left the other cop paraplegic after shooting him in the head and back. At the time of the event, Philistine was carrying cocaine while working as a drug courier. Kevin Marinelli, 28 years on death row. Marinelli received a death sentence and a 20 to 50-year prison term for the 1994 culpment murder of Konrad Damchuk. State appeal courts have upheld his conviction on first-degree murder, robbery, conspiracy, and burglary counts. According to his claims, a crucial prosecution witness was forced to give a false statement during his trial and was under duress not to testify during the 2000 appeals process. Out of the three guys involved in this case, Marinelli is the only one who has been found guilty of first-degree murder. Wayne Smith, 28 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced him to death for the murder of Eileen Jones. Smith allegedly killed Jones by strangling her because he was upset that the mother of two, and pregnant at the time, had rejected his advances. Smith, who had served time in jail for manslaughter in the past, was apprehended right away. Daniel Paddy, 28 years on death row. Two men were shot and killed on January 15, 1991, while playing basketball at the Panetti Playground in Philadelphia, which was located at the intersection of 22nd and Lippincott Streets. LaShawn saw the shootings from across the street. Despite her initial reluctance to assist the police, LaShawn provided a formal statement in which she named Paddy as one of the two guys who had carried out the shooting. LaShawn recognized Paddy from a picture array and was acquainted with him from their neighborhood. Paddy tried to intimidate her several times to not testify at his trial. She at one point accepted money to keep her mouth shut out of fear of what could have happened to her or her family. LaShawn agreed to collaborate with the police again, but she was still terrified of Paddy. One day, when she was leaving her mother's house, a car stopped a short distance away, and Paddy got out of it wearing a wig, a dress, and a paper towel to cover his face. He fired his gun multiple times, and LaShawn was fatally hit. Lenwood Mason, 28 years on death row. Pennsylvania sentenced Mason to death for the murder of a lady. Lenwood Mason was reportedly given a jail sentence for beating up the victim. Days after his release, Mason fatally stabbed the woman, according to court records. Yona Jeffries had been stabbed with a knife in her thigh, arm, chest, back, and head. At trial, Mrs. Jeffries' 4-year-old son testified that he was in bed with his mother when Mason barged into the bedroom and attacked his mother. George Ivan Lopez, Edwin Romero, 28 years on death row each. David Bolaski, an architect from Allentown, was murdered in 1995 by Edwin Romero and 3 other individuals. Romero and George Ivan Lopez were both given the death penalty. The 2 other men received prison sentences. After going to an apartment building he owned to collect rent from a tenant named Miguel Moreno, Bolaski, 41 years old, was robbed and murdered. George Ortiz Barbosa was given a life sentence after entering a guilty plea to first-degree murder. After admitting to organizing the crime, Moreno received a 20 to 40-year sentence. John Joseph Kohler, 28 years on death row. He was convicted of the first-degree murder of Regina Clark and her 9-year-old son, Austin Hopper. Kohler had previously been in a relationship with Regina. He did not murder the woman and the boy himself. He coerced another young man to do that by threatening his life. Mark Newton Spots, 28 years on death row. In 1995, Spots killed his brother and went on the run, executing 3 women in 3 counties in 3 days. Penny Gannett of New Salem, June Rose Olinger of Schuylkill County, and Betty Amstutz of Cumberland County were the 3 women who perished during carjackings, and Spots received the death penalty for each of them. Gerald Watkins, 27 years on death row. At her Homewood residence on July 20, 1994, Gerald Watkins fatally shot his girlfriend, Beth Ann Anderson, their 18-day-old baby, Melanie Jeray Anderson, and Mrs. Anderson's 9-year-old son, Charles Kevin Kelly Jr. The killings were particularly vicious. Anderson was shot 8 times, Kelly was shot 6 times, and Melanie was shot 8 times. All of the shootings occurred at close range. Christopher Roney, 27 years on death row. American rapper Christopher Roney, better known by his stage name Cool C, reached the height of his popularity in the late 1980s. Perhaps the most well-known thing about him now is the controversy surrounding his role in the January 1996 bank heist that resulted in the death of a Philadelphia police officer. He is presently detained and awaiting death in a state prison in Pennsylvania. His execution was scheduled for March 9, 2006. However, it has been postponed until today. Antian Robinson, 27 years on death row. Tara Hodge and Robinson had an inconsistent relationship from early 1993 till Hodge found out in February 1995 that Robinson was seeing someone else. After more than a year, they didn't see one another until March 30th, 1996, when Robinson and Hodge resumed a close friendship. Hodge spent one night on March 30th and April 30th, 4 days between May 10th and 13th, and one night on June 1st, 1996, with Robinson between the night of the incident in issue and March 30th, 1996. When Hodge replied to a personal ad in the local paper, she was introduced to Rashawn Bass on May 26, 1996. Hodge sent Robinson a letter terminating their relationship on June 10, 1996. Hodge worked the 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift at Walmart on June 29. Following her shift, Hodge met Bass at her apartment located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where they had a pizza delivered. Just after midnight, Robinson showed up at Tara Hodge's place as Bass was taking a shower. Hodge opened her apartment to him, and Robinson and Hodge got into a fight. Robinson drew a revolver, pointed it at Hodge, and shot her when she refused to ask Bass to leave. Hodge heard 3 gunshots. She collapsed to the ground, rendered senseless, as Robinson sprinted past her. Hodge regained consciousness in a pool of her own blood at around 1 in the morning. When she went into the bathroom, she discovered Bass dead in the shower. She managed to pull herself over to her neighbor's house next door. When the police got to the neighbor's house, they discovered Hodge was bleeding from the head. Unable to speak, she wrote a note telling the police to go to her flat. When the ambulance came, it took Hodge straight to the hospital. When the police arrived at Hodge's flat, they discovered Bass's body in the shower. The officer went to the hospital to talk with Tara Hodge after leaving the apartment, and she identified Robinson as the shooter. John Amos Small, 27 years on death row. Following his conviction for the murder and attempted essay of 17-year-old Cheryl Smith, Small was given a sentence on June 19, 1996. 5 weeks after Cheryl Smith vanished on September 15, 1981, a hunter discovered her severely decomposed remains a few yards from the Maryland state line and east of Cridler Schoolhouse Road. The adolescent from Midway, Adams County, was missing multiple front teeth and was completely nude. Her skull was crushed. According to the prosecution, Smith was killed by 2 hits to the head caused by a rock or other hard object. They added that they thought her attackers attempted to assay her. However, due to the body's disintegration, forensic specialists were unable to establish if that was really the case. Smith was killed in the woods while attending a drinking party with several teenagers and young adults. Several partygoers, including the victim's pals, were aware of what had happened, but none of them reported it to the police, according to the authorities. Arthur Jerome Bomar, 25 years on death row. Amy Willard was a standout lacrosse player at George Mason University, majoring in physical education and aspiring high school sports coach at the time of her death. She was the youngest of 3 children born to retired Chester Police Captain Paul Willard and nurse Gail Willard. On June 19, 1996, Amy Willard was returning home from Brookhaven after spending the night out with friends when Bomar pursued and kidnapped her near the Springfield exit of Interstate 476 onto the Media Bypass. In North Philadelphia, Bomar disposed of her body in a litter-filled yard at 16th Street and Indiana Avenue. The murder of Amy remained unsolved until June 5, 1997, when Bomar was taken into custody on an active warrant for violating his parole following a previous conviction for second-degree murder in Las Vegas. Frances Bauer Harris, 26 years on death row. Daryl Martin broke up a fight between Harris and Maxine Snook, his ex-girlfriend, on August 1, 1995, at the Pipeline Bar in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Harris was charged with aggravated assault after giving Martin a violent beating. The trial was set for November of 1996. Before that, Martin was one of the witnesses Harris had obtained the addresses from in the police reports of the other witnesses against him. Harris asked Kimberly Kistler, his ex-girlfriend, to make sure Martin indeed resided at the address he had gotten. He paid Kistler a visit on the weekend on November 2nd, 1996, at her residence in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Kistler had called Martin on November 3rd at his request, luring him into what turned out to be a tragic encounter. Kistler introduced herself to Martin as Patty, a woman from Ohio, and said that she had previously met him when he was drunk. She made plans to meet Martin for drinks that evening between 7:30 and 8 at the Tobias Frog restaurant in Lancaster. After scanning the area and arriving at the restaurant well ahead of the scheduled hour, Harris and Kistler waited for Martin in their car. They waited for Martin in a nearby parking lot. Harris cut the left front tire of Martin's car after Martin had arrived and entered the restaurant. Martin eventually exited the restaurant at around 8:45 p.m., got into his car, and tried to drive off. When he realized that his car had a flat tire, he turned into an abandoned Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. After that, he strolled back to the restaurant and used the payphone there to ask his brother for help. But Harris assaulted Martin with a knife when he came back to the Dunkin' Donuts lot. He killed Martin by slashing his throat so forcefully that the cut was more than 8 inches long and 3 inches deep. William Rivera, 26 years on death row. Mr. and Mrs. Kumok Kang closed their jewelry store on North Front Street in Philadelphia in the evening of September 25, 1995. After leaving the store, the Kangs crossed the street to their station wagon, which was parked there. Mrs. Kang had an ice box that she used to hold her lunch, her pocketbook, and a tiny paper bag with a beauty kit inside. Mr. Kang was holding an X-ray in a manila envelope. The Kangs approached the station wagon as Williams Rivera and his two collaborators, Robert Ortiz Bonilla and Luis Centeno, watched. The three men made up their minds to rob the couple because they thought the Kangs were carrying money in the manila envelope. The Kangs took Front Street towards Rising Sun Avenue, their customary route home. Mrs. Kang was seated on the passenger side of the car, driven by Mr. Kang. At Front Street and Rising Sun Avenue, Mr. Kang came to a stop at a red light. Mrs. Kang was startled to hear glass breaking and a man's yell for her husband to get out of the car. Mrs. Kang saw a revolver piercing the broken glass and pointing directly at her husband's chest. She then heard 2 gunshots. Mr. Kang was shot twice more after being held out in front of the vehicle. William Rivera was later identified as the shooter by eyewitnesses. After that, he got into the station wagon's driver's side while one of the accomplices, later revealed to be co-defendant Robert Ortiz Bonilla, opened the passenger side door and yelled at Mrs. Kang to get out of the vehicle. She was thrown out of the car while the station wagon was already moving, and Ortiz Bonilla took her wallet and sprang into the moving car. After that, the car continued north on Rising Sun Avenue. Mr. Kang was declared deceased at Einstein Hospital later that evening. He was shot 4 times in total, 3 times in the chest and once in the hand. Albert Reed, 25 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Reed to death for the murder of a lady and her daughter. Albert Reed shot and killed his estranged wife Carla Reed and her daughter after breaking into their home, according to court filings. William Wright, 23 years on death row. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania sentenced Wright to death for the murder of his neighbor. The victim and his wife had a brief separation, according to court records, during which the victim's wife met William Wright. Nevertheless, the affair was short-lived as the married couple got back together. William Wright broke into the house, followed the victim into a closet, and shot him many times. Jose Buzenet, 25 years on death row. Richard Boxley, 23 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania condemned Boxley and Buzenet to death for the murder of Jarvey Bolton. Court records state that they both plotted the victim's murder in connection with a narcotics deal. In broad daylight, the victim was fatally shot. Troy Drumheller, 23 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Drumheller to death for the murder of Carol Hutenstein. Court records reveal that Troy Drumheller had a history of violence against her. She was his occasional girlfriend who Drumheller viciously stabbed to death in 1999 after she obtained a protective order against him. Michael Brandon Singley, 22 years on death row. In August 2000, Singley entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder and additional charges related to the stabbing death of his cousin, Travis Rohrer's wife, Christine Rohrer. On election night in November 1998, Singley told Rohrer he had car issues and needed to use her phone before assailing her and binding her with duct tape in her house. After stabbing her 20 times, he shot and stabbed her husband Travis Rohrer when he returned home. Travis survived. Singley also murdered his cousin's neighbor, Jim Gillian, who confronted him after the incident. Richard Scott Baumhammers, 22 years on death row. On April 28, 2000, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, immigration attorney and spree killer Baumhammers started a series of racially motivated murders that left 5 people dead and 1 disabled. He went to the 63-year-old Jewish neighbor who lived next door, Nikki Gordon, at 1:30 p.m. and shot her dead before setting her house on fire. For 31 years, Gordon had been friends with Baumhammer's parents. Then he got into his black Jeep Cherokee and headed to the synagogue where Gordon belonged in Scott Township. After shooting at the synagogue's windows, he got out of his car and spray-painted 2 red swastikas on the structure. Anil Thakur, 31 years old, a native of Bihar, India, was shot and killed during his lunch break at the India grocer at Scott Town Center, just a short distance from the synagogue. Sandeep Patel, a 25-year-old store manager, was shot in the neck and became paralyzed. Patel would spend the next 7 years confined to a wheelchair before passing away in February 2007 at the age of 32. This happened following complications brought on by pneumonia. Baumhammers drove to Carnegie's Ahabat Akim congregation and shot to smash the synagogue's glass windows. He went inside Yafei Chinese cuisine at Robinson Town Center, which is roughly 10 miles from his house. There, 2 Asian Americans, the 34-year-old manager of the Chinese restaurant and the 27-year-old Vietnamese American cook, were shot and killed in front of customers. Baumhammers drove from Robinson Town Center to C.S. Kim School of Karate in Center Township, Beaver County, where a 22-year-old African-American man named Gary Lee was practicing karate with a friend who was European-American named George Thomas. After aiming the gun at Thomas for a moment, Baumhammers turned and shot Lee, instantly killing him. In the Pennsylvanian town of Ambridge, Richard Baumhammers was detained at 3:30 p.m. after being pulled over in his Jeep. His 2-hour rampage covered a distance of 15 miles, crossing 3 townships. Theodore Davidow, 22 years on death row. Davidow was taken into custody by Ohio police and FBI agents in 1997 on suspicion of attempted murder, kidnapping, essay, and weaponry. Davidow was found guilty on reduced charges of assault and escaped from Ohio's Belmont Correctional Institution. Having served just 2 years, he was granted release. In January 2000, he moved back to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, along with his girlfriend Angelina Taylor and their 2-year-old kid. A few months later, on May 12, 2000, Davidow was charged with essaying the 20-year-old lady and beating her to death. The unmarried couple had a long history of violence, according to testimony given during a preliminary hearing. According to a forensic pathologist's testimony, Taylor had severe beating-related cerebral hemorrhages and serious head injuries before passing away. In addition, he added that Angie Taylor had bruises all over her body, as well as ligatures and scratches on her neck. According to medical proof, Angie was essayed. In court, Davidow's younger sister said that the altercation between Angie Taylor and her brother was so severe that she had to leave the house and call the police, claiming that a guy was beating up a girl. There was no one answering the door when the police arrived. According to Davidow's testimony, he heard police approaching and became frightened, leaving the house through the roof. A longtime acquaintance of Davidow's said that on the morning of the murder, he informed her he had hit Angie because he was angry. Davidow allegedly informed the woman that Angie was breathing funny as he departed from their house. Although she could not stand up, Davidow reported that her eyes were open. Angie Taylor was discovered by police on a mattress in a 3rd-floor bedroom after breaking through a window in the property. She was practically naked and unconscious. Ronald Taylor, 22 years on death row. John DeWitt, a maintenance worker, grabbed the hammer in self-defense because he was so afraid of Ronald Taylor's verbal abuse. He was trying to fix a door at Taylor's residence. Taylor remained angry when DeWitt left after being summoned away for another job. Shortly after, Taylor opened fire at one of DeWitt's co-workers and then proceeded to shoot at 2 fast food businesses located in the Pittsburgh suburbs. There were 3 people badly injured and 2 dead. Taylor, who was 39 years old at the time, was taken into custody in an office building after he kept law enforcement for 2 hours at a senior hospice center, holding 4 or 5 individuals hostage in wheelchairs. Kenneth Hairston, 21 years on death row. After killing his wife Catherine, Hairston set the house on fire, killing Sean Hairston, age 5. Kenneth Hairston was discovered by firefighters at the top of the basement stairway inside the kitchen. He had a laceration on the right side of his neck and multiple puncture wounds to his chest. He was very aggressive towards the paramedics, and before being taken to the hospital, he had to be secured with handcuffs and stretcher straps and then given paralyzing medication. Catherine was discovered in the kitchen by firemen. When she was taken out of the house, she was dead weight and had a hole in the side of her skull. Her blood sample did not exhibit any signs of cyanide or carbon monoxide according to toxicology screening. Sean was on the living room couch, laying beneath bags and rubbish when they found him. There was a blanket over his head and face. When paramedics found him, he was still alive, but he had 2 heart arrests and passed away in the hospital while receiving treatment. 2 or 3 instances of blunt force trauma to the head were the injuries that ultimately resulted in his death. Herbert Blakeney, 21 years on death row. Herbert Blakeney's estranged wife, Sasha Blakeney, shared an apartment with Duana Swanson and their kids at 63 North 14th Street in Harrisburg. On February 1, 2000, Harrisburg police responded to a report of a domestic disturbance at the residence. They saw Blakeney and Sasha fighting. Blakeney was taken by the cops from the flat to his home because he would not leave. Later that evening, Sasha left the house, leaving her 2 infant children, Basil and Aaliyah, with Swanson and her son Maurice, who was 13 years old. Blakeney went back to the flat to get some clothes. He also called the apartment multiple times requesting to talk to Sasha. Because she was afraid, Swanson had her friend Garth George stay with her until Sasha got back. Additionally, Swanson told Sasha that Blakeney had visited the apartment. In the early hours of February 2, 2000, Blakeney broke into the apartment brandishing a butcher knife and approached Swanson and the kids in a bedroom. With the kids gathered around the bed, Blakeney leaped on it, took Swanson by the arm, and held her out. He let go of Swanson to pursue Maurice as soon as he fled the room. Upon arriving at the rear door, Maurice opened it to discover Harrisburg's police officer William Vernowski standing in the threshold with his revolver out. The officer heard a woman screaming for assistance inside the house as he arrived at the residence, and he went to the rear door while responding to a pending incident. Blakeney turned to face Swanson at that moment, stabbing her in the chest with his butcher knife. Swanson's hands sustained additional damage throughout the struggle. Blakeney was repeatedly urged to put down the knife by Officer Vernowski, but he persisted in trying to stab Swanson. Swanson and Blakeney collapsed to the ground. With his knife in hand, Blakeney leaned over Swanson and choked her until she passed out. Blakeney turned his back on Swanson and kept going in and out of the bedroom while yelling, "Shoot me, shoot me." He was threatening Officer Vernowski with a knife. Then, reaching over to the kids who had been sleeping on the bed, Blakeney grabbed Sasha's 14-month-old son Basil and held him in his left arm while he held the knife in his right, putting the blade against Basil's throat. Officer Vernowski tried to talk with Blakeney, but he would not put the baby down and he fled into a back stairwell. Blakeney proceeded to cut Basil's throat in a back and forth motion with the butcher knife, resulting in a gaping stab wound in the child's neck that went all the way to the bone. It was only after being shot 3 times by Officer Vernowski that Blakeney gave up control of the child. The officers failed in their attempts to resuscitate the baby. My question is, why didn't they just shoot him? They stood there watching him murder Swanson with bare hands after stabbing her several times, and then when he took the baby, why they didn't just shoot him? Why? I feel like they should have taken some type of action, not just let him murder everyone. Stephen Triber, 21 years on death row. Triber set his house on fire on the evening of March 9, 2001, while Jessica, his 2-year-old daughter, and girlfriend Denise Riddle were sleeping inside. Triber and Mrs. Riddle fled the burning house, but Jessica stayed in her crib until firefighters came to take her out, but it was too late. Triber's neighbor, who ran to assist after smelling smoke coming from the house, testified throughout the trial that Mrs. Riddle was screaming for assistance
While Triber was standing quietly with his arms folded on a second-story deck, Triber inquired about his dog's well-being but remarked, "The fireman will get her," in reference to Jessica. "In any case, she's probably dead," he said. A fire marshal who examined the scene testified that gasoline, clothes, straw and candles were used to ignite the fire at 2 locations, one in the garage and one in the basement. One wire had been severed and the house's security system had been turned off. The marshal also saw a chain ladder attached to the house. It appeared to have been tacked to the house lately, as there were no rust marks on it. Triber was unexpectedly composed and Jessica's bedroom door was open. Ernest Hulliver, 19 years on death row. According to court records, Hulliver shot and killed his estranged wife and their 2 children after breaking into their house. This murder took place on December 24th. The bodies of his wife Jean and his daughters, 20-year-old Victoria and 15-year-old Elizabeth, were discovered on Christmas morning. The girls accused Hulliver of essaying them for years, and he was facing trial for those charges. Sergeant Robert Gilver stated that he visited the Hulliver residence on Christmas morning in a response to a call from family in the Johnstown region asking why they hadn't shown up as scheduled. Gilver claimed that as soon as he entered the kitchen from the garage, he saw Jean Hulliver's body. A noise pulled officers upstairs, where they discovered Victoria Hulliver's corpse. Madison, Victoria's 9-month-old daughter, was nestled in the crook of her outstretched arm. The child was weeping, but not hurt. Stretched out over a bed in a bedroom was Elizabeth Hulliver. Everyone had been shot in the head once. LeVar Brown, 18 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced him to death for the murder of Robert Crawford. Court records state that LeVar Brown killed Robert Crawford with a gunshot after harboring resentment towards the man. LeVar Brown was implicated in a pharmacy robbery 1 month earlier that resulted in the death of a man. Michael Pruitt, 19 years on death row. In 2005, Pruitt was found guilty of Greta Googler's murder that occurred 3 years prior. Inside her North 9th Street house, the 69-year-old Sunday school teacher was robbed, essayed, and strangled. The victim's nephew, Gary Googler, expressed his frustration that his aunt's murderer is still serving a jail sentence due to Governor Tom Wolf's 2015 moratorium on the death penalty.
Jerry Chambers, 18 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania convicted Chambers to death for the murder of a 3-year-old girl. He allegedly lost his temper when he observed the 3-year-old witnessing him having relations with her aunt, according to court filings. Chambers killed the young girl by throwing her into a radiator. Subsequent evidence revealed that Jerry Chambers had abused and beaten the home's children. The infant was discovered by the cops face up on a sofa. The EMTs tried to revive her even though they knew she had been dead for a while. She was later officially declared deceased when she got to the hospital. John Eichinger, 18 years on death row. John Charles Eichinger drove to the Greaves' house early on March 25, 2005. He threatened to kill Heather Greaves, according to what he told the police, unless she broke up with her most recent lover. In order for Heather to be prepared for him at her house that day, Eichinger set up a meeting with her. Before moving to a store close to his house, he worked with Heather Greaves at an Acme market in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. According to a police affidavit, Heather Greaves told a neighbor that she was anticipating Eichinger to drop by with flowers for her approaching birthday, but she simply saw him as a friend and wasn't interested in the love relationship he was looking for. Eichinger hid a big knife and rubber gloves under his sweat jacket, carrying them both in his belt. He went to talk to Heather inside the house. Following a disagreement, he took out his knife and repeatedly stabbed her in the stomach. Since he had heard in movies and books that it was easier to puncture organs in that area than through the chest, where it is more difficult because of hitting bone, Eichinger acknowledged that he intentionally stabbed Heather in the stomach. 3-year-old Avery, Heather's daughter, was present in the room when the stabbing occurred. Eichinger moved away from Heather and stabbed Avery in the neck as the mother begged the child to call 911. Avery fled down the corridor, but then she fell. Eichinger pursued her and saw Heather's sister Lisa emerge from the restroom. Lisa attempted to flee by running back into the restroom and closing the door, but Eichinger was too strong for her. He repeatedly stabbed her in the stomach. He then stabbed Avery in the back again before turning to go to the kitchen where Heather lay dying. He pinned her to the ground after stabbing her so violently that the blade protruded from her chest. Eichinger cut Heather's throat and stabbed her in the diaphragm. When he went to wash his hands at the sink, he saw that he had a cut. In order to keep his blood from being left at the murder scene, he put on one of the rubber gloves. To confuse the police, Eichinger sliced open Lisa's clothing before departing, giving the impression that she had been the object of a rampage. Later that day, Heather and Lisa's father discovered the bodies. Eichinger also admitted to killing Jennifer Still on July 6, 1999, using the same knife that was used in the Greaves' killings. Jennifer also rejected him, choosing to stay with the fiancé she already had. Darian Hauser, 18 years on death row. While executing a warrant for Darian Hauser on March 19, 2004, Sergeant Joseph Leclerc was shot and he died. Leclerc and 2 other police officers were shot by Hauser, according to the authorities. Though the 2 made it through, Leclerc passed away shortly after. Andre Staten, 17 years on death row. Andre Staten emotionally and physically abused Beverly Yon when they were in an intimate relationship. Yon and her 2 sons moved in with Yon's mother, Penny Lance, as a result of the violence. She told police that Staten had hit her in January 2004. On January 27, 2004, a temporary protection from abuse order was imposed against Staten. On February 19th, the trial court issued a final PFA order after a hearing. A few days later, on February 24, 2004, Staten confided in the bartender about his frustration with his girlfriend and how he had seen her through the window the previous evening. He added that he handed her a sizable sum of money for a house he was unable to maintain, but he promised to take care of the situation as soon as possible. The following morning, Staten was spotted inside a parked automobile around a block and a half from Yon's mother's house. When Justin, Yon's son, was outside the house, he noticed Andre Staten running up to the back porch and signaling for Justin to keep quiet with a finger to his lips. Staten went inside the kitchen by kicking in the door. He took out a knife from his jacket while Yon's son, Jeremy, was there in the room. He proceeded to stab Yon till she collapsed to the ground and the big knife was still embedded in her back. After that, Staten left out the back door and ran into Justin outside, who was prepared to leave for school in his car. After throwing Justin out of the car, Staten took off driving. Later that day, Yon's injuries claimed her life. Junius Burno, 17 years on death row. On April 13, 2003, Carlos Huarbe and Oscar Rosado were shot and killed by 2 individuals who broke into an apartment in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Following an investigation, Terence Betia was subsequently taken into custody by the Allentown police for the killings. Betia soon after accused Burno of being involved in the shootings. Burno turned himself in to the police on September 12, 2003, and he was immediately taken into custody. Burno chose not to discuss the killings with the police in the absence of legal representation. Burno hired Glennis Clark. In the weeks that followed, Burno gave the police several admissions of guilt over the killings. He intended to rob the 2 guys, but when they objected, he shot and murdered them both. Miguel Padilla, 17 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania condemned Padilla to death for a shooting that claimed the lives of 3 individuals. Miguel Padilla was unhappy that he had been turned away from an after-hours club according to court documents, so he returned later with a gun and shot the owner, a bouncer, and the customer to death. Anthony James Dick, 15 years on death row. Dick shot his wife first before shooting the 2 sleeping kids when they were staying at a nearby motel. The children did not survive the attack, but his wife did. In early 2006, he entered a guilty plea to the murders of his 18-month-old son and his 4-year-old stepson while they slept at the Stonecastle Motel. In addition, he entered a guilty plea to charges of attempted murder and aggravated assault on Betty, his wife, who was 23 years old at the time. The bodies of the 2 children were discovered on the ground, covered by blankets. Mrs. Dick made her way to a motel room nearby, where she called for help with another lodger. Dante Thomas, 16 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Thomas to death for the murder of a witness. A man who was scheduled to testify against Thomas's friend, who was being suspected of murder, was shot and killed by Dante Thomas, according to court filings. Patrick Jason Stoller, 16 years on death row. On May 30, 2003, Patrick Stoller was a day laborer for a landscaping business at Jean Heck's opulent Upper St. Clair residence. He missed work the following several days, scoping it out and formulating his plans to loot and kill Mrs. Heck before going back there by himself on June 4th. He broke into the residence, murdered the 78-year-old widow, and robbed her house and handbag. He then made multiple fruitless attempts to cash counterfeit checks at a nearby bank. Cletus Rivera, 15 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced him to death for the murder of a police officer. On August 6, 2006, Rivera shot and killed Reading police officer Scott Wirtz, according to court filings. As part of an undercover auto theft duty, Wirtz, who was 40 years old, and Officer Malcolm Edinger overheard reports over the police radio that gunfire was occurring in a parking lot near City Hall at 8th and Walnut Streets. Edinger claimed that after spotting Cletus Rivera with a rifle, he and Wirtz pursued him. According to Edinger, Rivera shot Wirtz in the buttocks and in his chest. Jeffrey Robert Martin, 15 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania condemned Martin to death for the essay and killing of 12-year-old Gabrielle Bacon. Jeffrey Martin abducted, molested, and killed a girl whose body was discovered 5 days later. Martin says he did not kill her. He claims a man offered him $100 to assist in burying the body and an ATV. During the hearing, Martin's daughter testified that when she was 6 years old, her father had abused her. Abraham Sanchez, 15 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Sanchez to death for robbery murder. Ray Dinarin was killed by Abraham Sanchez, according to court records, following a failed robbery attempt at the victim's residence. While searching for a house to break into, Sanchez and his 3 pals drove past a remote house with a light on and the victim seated at a table. One of the defendants, Lorenzo Schriver, rang the doorbell as Sanchez and 2 others hid in the bushes. When Diener answered, Shriver informed him that his car had broken down, so the victim proceeded to retrieve his phone. He came back and gave it to Shriver. Emerging from the shadows, Sanchez held Diener at gunpoint and told him to get down. He wrestled with Sanchez for the gun, but he suffered a hip fracture after Sanchez fired a shot that struck him in his thighs. Diener collapsed to the floor, screaming for help. He was shot in the chest by Sanchez as he retreated. The victim was injured in the neck and shoulder by Sanchez's 3rd round. He died while the robbers fled the scene. Robert Diamond, 15 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced him to death for 2 workplace murders. 2 people, Angel Guadalupe, 46 years old, and Reginald Woodson, 52 years old, were shot and killed by Diamond inside the Simon & Schuster warehouse in Bristol, according to court filings. Robert Diamond was accused by the prosecution of thinking that he was being harassed by minority employees at the warehouse. Albert Perez, 14 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced him to death for a double murder. Perez killed 22-year-old Ducelis Diaz Santiago and her 5-year-old daughter Kayla, according to court records. Kayla was strung up by her pajamas, while Diaz Santiago was strangled and then hung in a closet. Harvey Johnson, 14 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced him to death for the murder of a 2-year-old. Court filings claim that 2-year-old Darisabel Baez, his girlfriend's child, was brutally beaten by Harvey Johnson. According to medical professionals, the tiny child suffered over 200 injuries during the 45-minute battering. In the couple's York apartment, Harvey Johnson beat 2-year-old Darisabel with a video game cable, one of the girl's hiking boots, and his fists on April 6, 2008. At Hershey Medical Center, the girl passed away the following day. Louis Jordan, 14 years on death row. Jordan carried out 6 armed robberies of North Philadelphia's retail food stores over the course of around 6 weeks in the fall of 2007. In particular, Jordan robbed 3 separate Dunkin' Donuts locations at gunpoint on September 18, 2007, September 21, 2007, and October 13 the same year. He stole from 2 pizzerias on October 20th and October 25th. At last, on October 31st at 10:30 a.m., Jordan went back to the Dunkin' Donuts location where he had committed his initial robbery and once more demanded money at gunpoint from the staff members. Officer Charles Cassidy pulled up in his police attire, parked in front of the store, and unlocked the door as this last theft was taking place. Jordan turned to face the police as he was ready to enter the business, moved 2 steps in his direction, pointed a gun at him, and fired a close-range bullet that struck the officer in the forehead. Jordan left the scene right away, bending over to retrieve the service handgun that had belonged to the fallen officer. Jordan took a bus to Miami on November 3, 2007, where he was detained a few days later and he returned to Philadelphia. Omar Sharif Kash, 10 years on death row. Kash had a reputation for committing increasingly brutal crimes while evading punishment. In a brutal 3 weeks in the spring of 2008, his criminal career came to an end when he carjacked a couple in Bucks County, he killed a man in Philadelphia, and he assaulted his fiancée. Shortly after, he was taken into custody. Maurice Patterson, 13 years on death row. In March 2007, Eric Sawyer, then 38, was shot twice in the head in a Williamsport alley. The prosecution claims that because Sawyer was collaborating with the authorities, Patterson was informed by his drug-dealing colleagues to order the shooting. Sean Durant, 41 years old, admitted to being the gunman and entered a guilty plea. Nonetheless, he testified that Patterson had orchestrated the shooting. In the same case, another man is incarcerated for life. Kevin Edward Mattison, 13 years on death row. On December 9, 2008, Mattison broke into Christian Agosto's home and stole a pound of Mary Jane before shooting him in the head. Agosto was just 34 years old. Agosto's fiancée, Tiffany Kenny, had received a call from someone informing her that Agosto was seeing someone else. On December 9, 2008, at approximately 11 p.m., Kenny met Mattison and they headed to Agosto's apartment. Agosto and the woman he was with were confronted by Kenny once she entered his apartment. According to the authorities, Mattison followed Kenny into the flat, pulled a revolver, and told everyone to get on the ground. Kenny escaped into the corridor as Mattison insisted Agosto reveal the location of the Mary Jane. After taking the pound of Mary Jane from a kitchen cabinet, Mattison shot Agosto once in the head and then he ran away. Hector Manuel Morales, 13 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Morales to death for the murder of Ronald Lee Simmons. Hector Morales broke into his residence and shot him numerous times, killing him, according to court filings. Simmons was scheduled to testify against Morales in a federal drug investigation. Michael Eric Ballard, 12 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Ballard to death for a quadruple murder. Ballard was recently released on parole as per court documents following his incarceration for a murder conviction. After his release, he fatally stabbed his ex-girlfriend Denise Murphy, 39 years old, her father Dennis Marsh, 62 years old, her grandfather Alvin Marsh Jr., 87 years old, and Stephen Zernhelt, 53 years old, a neighbor who had gone over to investigate the noise. Richard Edward Poplawski, 12 years on death row. A mother and her 22-year-old son got into a fight over a dog urinating inside the home, which led to the incident that occurred on Saturday, April 4, 2009. 22-year-old Richard Poplawski opened fire on 2 Pittsburgh police officers at around 7:11 a.m. after his mother called 911 to ask the officers to take her son out of the house. In the end, 3 police officers were officially declared deceased, while 2 more suffered critical injuries. Poplawski was armed with a semi-automatic AK-47 style rifle, a shotgun, and 3 handguns, all of which were concealed within a bulletproof vest, and he had been waiting for the cops, according to Pittsburgh Police Chief Nathan Harper. He kept the police at bay for 4 hours, witnesses and police claim, while the fallen officers lay bleeding close to the scene and their colleagues were unable to help them. Poplawski and the SWAT squads fired more than 600 shots. The fatalities were the first City of Pittsburgh police officers to die while performing their duties in 18 years. After an Oakland, California shooting in March 2009, the incident was the second deadliest attack on U.S. police enforcement since the September 11 attacks. On June 28, 2011, Poplawski was found guilty on 3 charges of first-degree murder and given a death by lethal injection sentence. Glenn Lyons, 12 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Lyon to death for killing Katie Leibig via torture. Court documents state that he stabbed her more than 30 times after becoming enraged when she tried to stop their romance. After stabbing her with kitchen knives, Lyons removed her belongings and threw them in a garbage can along with his hoodie drenched in blood. After that, he went on the run for a few days using drugs before being apprehended in Philadelphia. Michael John Parrish, 11 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania condemned Parrish to death for the killing of his 23-year-old girlfriend, Victoria Adams, and their 18-month-old son, Sidney Parrish. Court records state that after an argument, former correctional officer Michael Parrish shot and killed Sidney Parrish and Victoria Adams. George Hitcho Jr., 11 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Hitcho to death for the killing of Robert Lasso, a police officer in Freemansburg, in August of 2011. According to testimony, when the 31-year-old father of two knocked on Hitcho's door regarding a fight between him and a neighbor, Hitcho's two dogs aggressively approached him. Hitcho shot Lasso in the head with a shotgun through his door, as Lasso withdrew a stun pistol to defend himself from the dogs. Expert witnesses stated that Lasso passed away nearly instantly. Jakeem Liddell Towles, 11 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Towles to death for killing Cornell Stewart. After Cornell Stewart finished his performance at a rap concert, Jakeem Towles shot and killed him, according to court filings. Towles started an altercation and was kicked out of a club on North 4th Street. He returned with a gun, according to the prosecution, and shot Stewart in the head when he opened fire on a crowd outside the concert. Melvin Knight, 5 years on death row. Ricky Smyerns, 11 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Ricky Smyerns and Melvin Knight to death for torturing and killing Jennifer Doherty. Doherty was tortured, according to court records, before being killed and thrown into a trash can. For almost 3 days, Smyerns and his 5 housemates from Greensburg held 30-year-old Jennifer Doherty captive. She was methodically abused by the group before she was fatally stabbed. Her body was found inside a garbage can in a parking lot blanketed in snow, draped with Christmas lights. All 6 of the roommates were convicted for involvement in the Doherty murder. Angela Marinucci, now 24 years old, was convicted of first-degree murder and is serving a life sentence. Amber Meidinger, 27 years old, who testified against her co-defendants, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of third-degree murder and is serving a maximum of 80 years in prison. Robert Masters, 43 years old, and Peggy Miller, 34 years old, also pleaded guilty to charges of third-degree murder. Masters is serving up to 70 years in prison, and Miller was sentenced to spend up to 75 years behind bars. Timothy Jacoby, 9 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Jacoby to death for the murder of Monica Schmeier. Timothy Jacoby broke into Monica Schmeier's house, killed her, and then plundered the place, according to court filings. The ex-husband of Monica Schmeier had been friends with Timothy Jacoby. Jacoby belonged to the Orange Shorts Society, an unofficial club that got together at the Hooters on Route 30th. The restaurant's waitress's shorts hue inspired the name of the group. John, Schmeier's ex-husband, was among the attendees. He discussed his divorce and mentioned that he gave his former wife $1,700 in cash per month for alimony. Throughout her life, she had a tendency of holding money in white envelopes throughout the house. Jacoby failed to show up for an Orange Shorts Society meeting on the day of the murder. After an extensive investigation, the police charged him with the murder. Christopher Lynn Johnson, 11 years on death row. Johnson received a death sentence for the killing of David Grove, a Game Commission officer. Christopher Johnson allegedly opened fire on Game Commission officer David Grove as he approached his car in regards to deer poaching, according to court filings. When the officer attempted to handcuff Johnson, Johnson shot Grove with a revolver after dropping the car keys as directed. Investigators discovered 25 casings, and they concluded that 15 of them originated from Johnson's handgun, indicating that he had reloaded it during the gunfight. Johnson, who also had been hurt, was taken into custody after being given a ride to a hunting camp. Kevin Murphy, 11 years on death row. Murphy was found guilty in 2013 of 3 first-degree murder counts related to the 2009 killings of his mother, sister, and aunt at the family's glass company outside of Salzburg. Murphy's 69-year-old mother, 43-year-old sister, and 81-year-old aunt disapproved of his relationship with a married woman, so he shot them all. Arik Shane Woodard, 10 years on death row. Woodard was found guilty in 2013 of first-degree murder after killing 2-year-old Jacques Omari twin on November 7, 2011, when the toddler and his younger sister were under his care. Police were called to a residence on November 7, 2011 at 2:25 p.m. for a kid who was experiencing cardiac arrest, according to Woodard's charging filings. After being taken to a York hospital, Jacques was declared dead at 3:05 p.m. When Woodard realized Jacques had smeared feces on the kitchen carpet, he attacked the boy. Woodard had left the kids alone to visit a neighboring store. Patrick Ray Haney, 10 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Haney to death for the murder of Trenton St. Clair, a 4-year-old boy. He was the son of Patrick Haney's girlfriend, and he was severely beaten according to court filings. Heather Forsett, the mother of the child, was accused of permitting the abuse to occur. She informed the jury that she witnessed Haney abusing her son and bruising him all over, but she remained silent out of fear. Raghunandan Yandamuri, 9 years on death row. In 2014, he was given the death penalty for kidnapping and killing a 61-year-old Indian woman and her 10-month-old granddaughter. It was seen as part of a botched kidnapping for ransom plot. He is the first Indian American to face the death penalty. Charles Ray Hicks, 9 years on death row. He was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Diana Knoll, whose severed remains were discovered in trash bags alongside Interstate 80 and 380 close to Stroudsburg. Hicks was sentenced to death, and authorities claimed that while Knoll was still alive, Hicks began violently beating and dismembering her. Her hands were discovered concealed within his house's walls. Jordan Alexander Clemens, 9 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania sentenced Clemens to death for the murder of his estranged girlfriend, Carissa Kunko. In January 2012, her body was discovered in Washington County's Mount Pleasant Township. Someone had cut her throat. Despite the beatings she had received from him in the past, she agreed to see him because she loved him. Marcel Emmanuel Johnson, 8 years on death row. The state of Pennsylvania condemned Johnson to death for the killing of a 4-year-old girl and a pregnant woman. Johnson fatally stabbed Romani Rankins, age 4, and Ebony Talley, along with her unborn child. He attempted but was unable to conceal his crimes, setting the apartment on fire before driving off in a car that a witness saw. Before the arson fire, Talley had sustained about 30 stab wounds. Because of his mother's wounds, the male fetus inside Talley's womb also died. Although emergency responders sent the little girl to the hospital, a large knife wound to her upper chest ultimately claimed her life as well. Her stomach was also burned in the 3rd degree. Tam Lee, 7 years on death row. He killed 2 brothers and disposed of their remains at Kelly Drive. Tam Lee received 2 consecutive death sentences. He kidnapped, tortured, and stabbed Vu and Viet Huynh in August 2014 over a drug debt. Eric Matthew Frayne, 7 years on death row. Late on September 12, 2014, during a shift change, Frayne pulled out a rifle and opened fire outside the Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Barracks in the Pocono Mountains in the township of Blooming Grove, Pennsylvania. Corporal Brian Dixon, a 38-year-old trooper, was killed and Trooper Alex Douglas was gravely injured. He expressed his desire to incite a revolution by his activities in a letter to his parents. 3 days after the shooting, Frayne was named as a suspect. He was the subject of an extensive manhunt until being apprehended 48 days later on October 30, 2014, in an abandoned airport. Leighton Javanza Thomas, 6 years on death row. On June 11, 2015, Lisa Sheets and her 16-year-old daughter Haley were found dead at their residence. Thomas murdered them both. Additionally, Sheets' 15-year-old daughter was stabbed by Thomas, who seriously hurt her. For this offense, he was found guilty of attempted murder. Ramael Sal Holt, 4 years on death row. Officer Brian Shaw of New Kensington Police was shot and killed in 2017 and Ramael Salholt was found guilty of the crime. On November 17, 2017, while attempting to pull over Tevin Harper's Jeep in New Kensington, the rookie cop lost his life. Jurors found that Holt shot Officer Shaw while running on foot through a dark parking lot after jumping from the car while he was a passenger. Devon Unique Anderson, 1 year on death row. In the summer of 2020, Devon Anderson, who was 27 years old, shot and killed his girlfriends Sydney Parmley, 23 years old, and Kaylee Lyons, 23 years old, believing that Parmley was having an affair and that Lyons, who was several weeks pregnant, would report him for killing his other girlfriend. Given that his 13-month-old child was present for both killings, a Cumberland County jury found him guilty on 2 degrees of first-degree murder of an unborn child, and endangering the welfare of a child. Richard Roland Laird, 34 years on death row. Following Anthony Milano's death on December 15, 1987, Richard Roland Laird and Frank Chester stood trial together in 1988 on allegations of murder and other offenses. Both men acknowledged witnessing Milano's death during the guilt phase, and each claimed the other was the murderer. Both were found guilty of every charge. Milano consented to drive Chester and Laird home. An hour or so later, the 3 people, still in Milano's car, drove into the township's woods, pulled over to the side of the road, and got out. Milano fell on the ground when Chester repeatedly kicked or hit him in the head. Laird killed Milano by repeatedly slashing his throat with a box cutter after jumping on top of him, pinning him to the ground. David Chmiel, 21 years on death row. On September 21, 1983, at around 9 in the morning, Mary Drake, a nurse hired to care for James Lunario, discovered that he, his brother Victor, and sister Angelina had all been murdered in the Throop, Pennsylvania home they shared. The results of the autopsy revealed that Victor had 12 stab wounds, James had 10, and Angelina had 11. Defensive wounds to the hands and/or arms were also sustained by James and Angelina. Based on the autopsy's physical results, as well as the visual and verbal testimonies from witnesses, the medical examiner determined that all 3 victims died between Tuesday, September 20, 1983 at 11 p.m. and Wednesday, September 21, 1983 at 2 a.m. Several neighbors' contributions of information allowed for the narrowing of the time of death. On September 20th at around 11 p.m., a neighbor heard Angelina call to Victor while he was walking his dog and saw him standing at the kitchen doorway of the Lunario residence. At 11:45 p.m., Linda, another neighbor, heard her dog howling and looked out her window to see a powder blue car with a gleaming grille and hood ornament parked next to her own vehicle. When he got home on September 21st between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m., her spouse also noticed this car. According to both witnesses, the car had left by 8 a.m. Later, Linda recognized the car in a picture as the one she had seen in front of her house. She also recognized the car at a state police garage as the vehicle she had seen the evening of the killings. Chmiel owned the car in the picture and the one in the garage. Stephen Rex Edmiston, 34 years on death row. On October 5th, in the early hours of the morning, 2-year-old Bobby Jo Matthew was taken from her bed. State police questioned Edmiston, a previous boyfriend of the child's grandmother and a friend of the child's parents, in relation to her disappearance. He prepared a map for the police that showed the location of the body, marked with an X. The child was essayed by Edmiston, who also scalped her and broke her skull. She also had burns on her face and chest, as well as a puncture wound in her chest. According to the prosecution, she attempted to crawl under Edmiston's car to get away from the assay, but the hot catalytic converter of the car burned and injured her. This is how the puncture and burns occurred. Robert Hughes, 34 years on death row. After killing restaurant manager Gene Rader, 41 years old, and employee Charles Haggerty, 46 years old, in an execution-style manner, Hughes was charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide, 2 counts of criminal homicide, and other connected felonies. In the Westchester restaurant, both victims were shot in the head at close range, according to Chester County District Attorney James McAllery. Anthony Reed, 33 years on death row. On July 9, 1988, Mark Lisby stole from his uncle Terence Lisby about $500 worth of crack cocaine capsules, or caps. The following day, the victim told Lisby that he had used the caps but lacked the funds to reimburse him. Lisby was employed by Lawrence Boston, a crack cocaine dealer, and both of these people were trying to join the Junior Black Mafia, or JBM, a criminal organization with its headquarters in Philadelphia. Lisby and Boston, respectively, worked for Kevin Bauman, a member of JBM. The victim met with Bauman to explain the problem and offered to make up the lost money the next week once he realized that Bauman would be concerned about the pills being missing. 2 days later, Boston showed up at the victim's Philadelphia home because he had not been paid by Lisby for the narcotics. Anthony Reed, one of the JBM members, joined Boston. Reed, Boston, and the victim had a brief talk before leaving the residence and heading west on Cumberland Street. Reed pulled out a gun as the men got closer to the intersection of Cumberland Street and 31st Street. He shot the victim 3 times, once in the back of his right knee, once in the center of his chest, and once in his upper right chest under the collarbone. On March 13, 1989, just after 3 in the morning, police responded to a shooting at the public housing complex known as Richard Allen Homes. They discovered the bodies of Neil Wilkinson, 18 years old, who had been shot to death, and Daryl Woods, 20 years old, who was still alive but had sustained 6 gunshot wounds to his left knee, left arm, stomach, and hip. On April 10, 1989, authorities detained Reed, and on June 27, they detained Bauman. Reed was on bond at the time of his arrest, awaiting trial on the murder charge related to Mark Lisby's killing. After that, on May 11, 1989, he was taken into custody and accused of killing Michael Waters, a 16-year-old, on March 7, 1989. Sheldon Hannibal, 29 years on death row. After a disagreement with the victim, Peter LaCourte, regarding the legitimacy of a gold necklace, Hannibal Sheldon and co-defendant Larry Gregory grabbed the chain and pistol-whipped LaCourte. Hannibal threatened to shoot LaCourte, so he stopped trying to run away. After dropping to his knees and placing his hands behind his head, LaCourte was shot 6 times by Hannibal, resulting in his death. Tanisha Robinson, then 15 years old, heard gunshots as she was fleeing the site of the robbery and beating, and she later provided a statement to the police. She provided testimony throughout their initial hearings as well, but on August 4, 1993, she and 2 of her female companions were killed in an execution-style manner in an apartment in the same housing development where LaCourte was killed, by close-range bullets to the head. Hannibal asked his friends to get rid of Robinson so that she would not testify in his trial. Harvey Robinson, 29 years on death row. He is regarded as one of the history's youngest serial killers. In addition, he is the first serial killer in Allentown, Pennsylvania history. Robinson was arrested when he was just 19 years old. His first victim was a 29-year-old nurse assistant named Joan Burgart. In August 1992, she was bludgeoned and essayed at her East Allentown home. Robinson kidnapped, essayed, and stabbed 15-year-old Charlotte Schmoyer, a newspaper girl, in June 1993. When she saw no sign of the girl, one of Charlotte's frequent newspaper customers observed Charlotte's cart outside her front window and called the morning call offices. When Charlotte's managers were unable to find her either, they called the police. Charlotte's body was discovered nearby in a densely forested region the same afternoon. She had suffered more than 20 stab wounds and she was essayed. Jessica Jean Fortney, a 47-year-old grandmother, was essayed and strangled by Robinson the following month. Denise Sam Kelly, his 4th victim, was battered and essayed but managed to escape alive. Robinson went back to Denise's residence where he was shot at by a policeman who was standing by. Robinson was apprehended after being located and traced to a nearby hospital. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.